So let's get back into it. One of the things I really like about the last few books that you've done, your own monographs, is how each one focuses on a different part of the natural world and seeing how that has a lot more agency and divinity than a normal like scientific mentality would attribute to it, right? So River of Love in an Age of Pollution, the Yamuna River of Northern India, that was in what, like 2006? A little more recently, People Trees, Worship of Trees in Northern India, another fantastic book. And then just this last year, Loving Stones, Making the Impossible Possible in the Worship of Mount Govardhan. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the kind of ethnographic work you've been doing in Northern India in general, because you've been doing this for many years.
Yeah, I would actually, there's one book before the three that you just mentioned that I would take us back to, and that is my book, Journey Through the 12 Forests. Because that was a book that began my own ethnographic work. I went to India as a textualist. I went to study a 16th century Sanskrit text, which I have studied and written on and translated it actually and published a translation of that. But I just happened to find myself living in the land of Braj, in the town of Vrindavan, because that's where the text was produced. But as I was living there and translating the text and meeting scholars and just meeting other residents of that region, I began to discover that really interesting things were going on with regard to the land, that friends would take me out to a site and show me a particular place and some maybe special feature of that place and have a story related to it. And I began to realize that I was in a what I call now a storied land, that there's just stories out there at each place connecting people to it. And then I discovered that there was a pilgrimage that took a month-long circular pathway around this region, visiting all these sites, hearing the story at the site itself. And that led to then my book project Journey Through the 12 Forests, where I was a participant and observer on the month-long pilgrimage and wrote about that. But it was at that time in that project that I came to encounter the notion of the land itself as divine. This is a culture associated with the Hindu god Krishna. And people would say that Krishna to Braje, Braj to Krishna, that is, the Braj is, that region itself is Krishna. And that gets worked out in very detailed, embodied ways. And Krishna is that land. So that identity between divinity and land, and the Yamuna River was part of that. So I began to develop that interest and began to be more interested in ethnographic work, because I think it was really my generation to a large degree that made the shift from history of religions being understood primarily as a textual approach to the study of religion to including now ethnographic approaches. And I think I'm a person who kind of went that particular direction. But it was the Yamuna River. And I first went to this region in 1980. So now I've been going for more than 40 years and visit pretty much annually, at least one visit annually. And during that period, just began to notice significant changes. The Indian economy was opened up and globalization began only in the late 1980s in India. And to watch the transformation of India, and particularly at an environmental level, really alarming, rapid changes were happening. And I was seeing that played out in the quality and quantity of the Yamuna River, and began to see the effect of that river. So I think that was my first questioning of environmental issues and the relationship between religion and ecology. So that was the first project where I wanted to ask questions. How is this river conceptualized? Because if I've learned one thing as a lifelong student of religion now, it's that nothing is innately anything for human beings. That we perceive the world and therefore experience the world and act in the world determined by a very particular cultural lens that was welded onto our eyeballs, to keep the metaphor going, through our primary socialization into a particular family and a particular time and place. And if you shift that lens, then the perception of the world is quite different. And one's relationship with the world and behavior in the world then is quite different. I think that's what fascinated me as a student of religion and as one who has been now increasingly concerned with environmental issues in the world, is where is religion in all this? And I like to think of a phrase that I attribute, and I think this is the case of Neil Evernden, who's an environmental historian, wrote a book called The Social Creation of Nature, kind of like the social construction of reality applied to nature. And he said, it's not so much that we have to come up with solutions to the environmental crises, but really what's more important is what he calls the recreation of things themselves. And what I think he means by that is a reconceptualization of the more than human world, because it's that leads to our behavior in the world, whether we're going to destroy the planet to dig up fossil fuels to burn in a manner that just is changing the whole atmosphere of the planet. How do we get to that point? How is it that we regard the world, that we do such things? And those are the questions that came up for me. Or what is a river? What is a river? And people have a ready answer to that, but of course it's a cultural product that they are unconsciously just mimicking in a way. So how to do that? And I think these are the kinds of questions. So I first look at the Yamuna River. How is she conceptualized in literature? And I can trace it back 3,000 years. So Hinduism has that advantage in ways. But as an ethnographer, I wanted to see how people understood that river during the time I was studying her. And so I traveled all along that river from its source up in the Himalaya to deep down on the plains, talking to temple priests, to ordinary worshipers of the river, to pilgrims visiting the pilgrimage sites along the river, to people who just daily interact with the river, whether it's for their professional interaction or just because they live by the river. And then to understand how the pollution of that river was affecting their relationship with the river, and therefore what are the kinds of theological transformations that are taking place due to the pollution of the river. So those are the questions I was interested in, as well as how does the religious tradition use its traditional resources to marshal some effort for trying to restore the river to health. After the river, and in this culture, there are three major features of the more than human world that are important, and that is the river, and specifically in this culture, I mean, this is general, but for this culture, the Yamuna River, and the forest, and it's the Brindavan forest for this culture, but trees and forests, and then finally the mountain, Mount Govardhan, which is, and so those were the three projects I took on specifically. And I don't really think I took them on as a trilogy, so to speak, when I began, but they became that. The tree book project there too, I began with the question, what is a tree? And then I shift to who is a tree? And there's a difference between those two questions that already show a cultural construction. What does a tree make sense to, and I write primarily for American audiences and publish with American presses, but what is a tree is a question that makes sense largely to an American audience. Who is a tree is a question that makes sense easily within Indian, Hindu religious culture. And to look at that. I mean, I could go on here. I could take a pause if you want to jump in, but I could then move it into my latest project with Loving Stones, which was just taking it on stones. But
Yeah, definitely. I want to hear about stones too, especially, I don't know, because I think when you talk about the agency or personhood or divinity of the more than human world, trees are growing and photosynthesize. You see rivers moving. A stone just sits there. That seems like that's going to be the hardest one to explain to somebody. No, there's agency in the stone. There's divinity. It's like it's just rocks, right?
well, I think you've hit the nail on the head, so to speak. With to me the challenge and my excitement with doing that book, and because when I often like to talk about my books, not after I publish them, but before. So on the kind of a lecture circuit, because I like the feedback. And when I was on my lecture circuit with the People Trees book, I would I would talk and then people, so there was a question and answer period always, but after that was finished, people would come up to me in numbers. And I became used to this after some time. And they would say, and I realized they were shy to say it in a public format, but they said, let me tell you about my special tree or my relationship with this particular tree. So that added to, an understanding of the kind of growing neo-paganism within popular American culture, as well as an interest in Native American cultures that regard trees differently. I came to the sense that although the idea that that a tree has a presence with which you can establish some significant relationship is there clearly on the periphery of American society. It's not mainstream, but it's there more than I thought. The idea that you can have a significant relationship with a stone, that pretty much breaks the cultural mode,
Yeah.
I think. And that's what I became interested in. And maybe to add to that, and I'm going to come back to that moment, but well, yeah, let me just jump into it. So that what I try to do in Loving Stones is not to simply present a study of this rich culture of the worship of mountain that is the most worshiped mountain in the world, I could say. And that's a large claim because there is one day of the year, it's a very special day, where there are crowds up to 8 to 10 million people will come and circumambulate the mountain and worship the mountain in some form. But over the year, I don't know how many millions of people actually visit this mountain. There are most likely a larger number of people that visit sacred mountains in China, but it's a sacred space in that case. The mountain isn't not considered to be an embodied form of divinity, or in the case of Mount Govardhan, the mountain is an embodied form of divinity. So in that sense, the mountain itself is worshiped as an embodied form of Krishna in this case. So it's a common feature, and I wanted to draw out what that world was all about as a lived form of Hinduism today. But I also, as a student of religion, am not just interested in writing books about a particular cultural phenomenon, but I also want to engage in some big, deep, juicy religious studies questions. What are the larger issues that I can bring to bear? So that I even say in the book that there's two ways of reading the book. One is that you can read it as a study of the worship of Mount Govardhan through the eyes of a scholar who is interested in or concerned with questions of radical cultural difference. Or you can read it as a way of how do we think about, how do we address radical cultural difference? And in the example of the worship of the stones from Mount Govardhan, right? So I think the book can be read in both ways. And therefore, one of the two major issues that I take on in the book is radical cultural difference. And how do we think about that? And how does one, so that the subtitle, Making the Impossible Possible, also refers to that, that my challenge as a teacher of other cultures to primarily an American student audience or readership, um, is how can I make something that is so seemingly absurd understandable in some way, so that one could even perhaps have an appreciation of it. And that's a major project that I try to take on in the book, with a recognition of just what you said. It just doesn't, that just seems like it's too much, too
Right.
much. And I evoke the work of the famous 19th century, early 20th century anthropologist E.B. Tyler, who many consider to be the quote father of cultural anthropology, because and look at the colonial nature of his project, because he talks about in his works the progressive theory of civilization. So colonialism was justified as a civilizing presence in the world, helping bring so-called primitive peoples to a civilized way of being. That's really the colonial project. And he is a colonial anthropologist, and I do label him that, is very much involved in that project. And so for Tyler, he does an analysis of global civilizations and arranges them on a hierarchical scale from the most primitive to the most civilized. And of course, the most civilized we find in Western Europe and North America, right? And the most primitive are those outside of all that. And when Tyler turns to placing a particular society on this hierarchical scale, he looks to religion. And it's the religious system of a society that determines whether they're primitive or civilized. And the more pervasive, widespread sacrality is, the more primitive it is. The more narrow the scope, the more civilized it is. So that the most transcendent view is understood to be the most civilized, and the most immanent view is the most primitive. And he goes on to say that those societies that will see spirit only in humans are the highest societies, the highest civilizations. Those then that see spirit or soul, also there in animals, are the next level down. The next level below that are those that see them in trees. But the bottom of the bottom are those that see them in stones. So
Wow.
that stones, so in Linnaeus's analysis of the physical world, stones, minerals, he called them, and the animals, plants, and minerals is at the bottom. So stones, even in this cultural perspective, are considered to be at the bottom of the heap, and stone worshipers are the most primitive. They're also at the bottom. So I just want to take all that on.
Yeah.
And I want to just question that and really see, in a certain sense, if it could be flipped on its head. And I don't, that's a kind of a judgment that I'm not so much interested in, as much as opening up perspectives that really appreciate cultural difference, particularly if Everton is right, at a time when we really need to be thinking about our conception of the more than human world. So here's where I think religious studies has something very valuable to contribute to that, in that there are historically as well as present different ways of conceptualizing the non-human world. And so this was a project to really get into that part of it.
Yeah, I like that. It's my knee jerk reaction would be to try and flip it on its head and be like, no, 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 it's the imminent people. That's the most. And once you've locked up divinity into just pure transcendence, what kind of civilization is that? I'm like, no, 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 let's try and appreciate trying to open up more plurality and cross cultural dialogue. And that seems to be the better way to go. And then it's one of those things that you can see, Christian theologians learning more from those kind of traditions, from indigenous traditions, from Hinduism, to maybe bring back some immanence into their understanding of God. And so, eco theology or feminist theology, process theology, all these things are saying, wait, maybe immanence, we need a little of it.
That's,
So,
I'd say that's precisely what is happening. I think
yeah,
of a book like Sally McVig's book, The Body of God. She's doing precisely that and is trying to bring back the concept of embodiment back into Christian theology, and ties that into the whole incarnational tradition of Christianity. So I'd say that's a way of definitely reading her book. And she is a biblical Protestant theologian doing that. And she has to stretch. I think for some Christians, she's stretching a way too much, but that's not a stretch within Hindu religious cultures to regard something like even a stone as an embodied form of divinity. So this is not symbolic representation, which comes out of what I would call the idolatry tradition of interpretation, which is another one that I very much take on, and that stone worship is considered to be the most heinous, degraded form of idolatry. And so I take on in a big way the whole place of the interpretive lens of idolatry in comparative study of religion that dates easily back to the 17th century. So that in the 17th century, there were considered to be, and that really is the time. Many people talk about comparative study of religion beginning with Max Mueller in the 19th century. I think that's wrong. I think that, again, a much stronger case for saying it goes back to the 17th century. But in the 17th century, there were 4 religions on the planet. 3 Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and then idolatrous paganism.
Right.
Those were, and so
Wow.
the comparative study of religion was a study of idolatry and paganism. Paganism is idolatry. It's the same thing.
Right.
Paganism is a term people are more comfortable with because so people have self-identified as pagans now, even in American society. I don't think anyone's self-identified as an idolater, but these are very much related. And something like stone worship, this intimate interaction with stones, is considered by definition of that 17th century understanding of idolatry, which came out of the Protestant Reformation, figures like John Calvin, and in his work where he says any notion of worship of a visible form of God is idolatrous. That's so that's that reinvention or a strengthening in a very particular way of the notion of idolatry that was at the heart of the religious revolutions that were going on in Europe in the 16th century. And idolatry was a fighting word. That was at the center at the wars between culture wars between Protestants and what emerged as Protestants and Catholics, where the Catholics were the idolaters.
Right.
But as the European nations began to move out through colonialism and conquest to different continents, that was very much carried with them. So that it was that study of idolatry that motivated a lot of the study of other cultures at the time. So I do a lot of that in the work itself, but it's more again to just to try to make understandable a culture that regards a mountain as an embodied form of divinity, without ever giving up at all the notion of the infinity and the formless nature of God. So that's not given up, but there is that other dimension, and it's the dimension that is most accessible to human beings from a level of divine grace. It is the form of God in which God makes itself, herself, himself most available for the human divine relationship. And in that sense, in the arena of worship, which aims at nurturing that relationship, embodied forms of divinity within Hinduism becomes so central.
Right. Yeah. So you're not giving up on the transcendent in favor of the immanent. You're really seeing how much they're woven together and making the impossible possible. Right.
Yeah.
You know,
How the infinite, formless infinite can take finite form.
and And it's not like every stone necessarily grabs people that way. I'm reminded of, Graham Harvey does a lot of work with, animism and indigenous traditions. And there's this one story he tells of talking to an Algonquin man and saying, "So you think all these stones are persons?" And the guy goes, "No, not all of them. It depends. And some of them have more personality than others." And so I'm wondering what's kind of the thing that seems to make a stone, in the context of your research, seem divine.
Well, I think there's many ways of answering that question, maybe beginning from more of an external perspective and working inward. First, it's a cultural perspective. And I ask people that question, why do you think that you see this stone as divine? And you're probably aware that in the society I come from, people don't see it as that. And they really, in their own words, gave an explanation of cultural construction of reality. And they said, because we were taught to see it that way.
Mm.
And or they might shift and to move in and layer, that's there's stories that tell that. So that storied world, but it's through narrative that so much cultural information is conveyed and embedded. So they grew up seeing it that particular way. And they're aware of the critiques of this in ways. And one man told me things like, you pay attention to something if you know something about it too. So there's a kind of knowledge. So maybe coming another level, there's a knowledge. And maybe two conversations come to mind. One, he said, one man told me, he said, if I showed you a picture of, he said, do you know what your great great grandfather looked like? And I said, well, I don't actually. And he said, so if I showed you a picture of him, you would just look at it and, maybe someone, but you wouldn't be that interested in him. If I told you this is a picture of your great grandfather or great great grandfather, then you take an interest in it. And his point was, once you have some knowledge of it, you look at it in an entirely different way. Another man told me that he held up his watch and he pointed to the hour hand on his watch, and it was an old-fashioned turning hand. He said, "Is that moving?" I said, "Yeah, it'll move." And he said, "But how do you know that? It's not based on observation. It's based on my knowledge of what that's working." And both of them get it, that there's a knowledge that is necessary to have a particular experience, which is not unrelated to what I began with, and that is a certain cultural lens is what determines it. Added to that, I think then it's just the fact that so many people for so many years have worshiped this mountain. There is a presence there, however you regard that presence, even from a sociological perspective. But obviously this particular mountain had been identified as the mountain of the story, or the story came out of the mountain. It's kind of a chicken or egg sort of issue. But at the end of the day, it is a mountain that is accepted as an embodied form of divinity. And in my book, Loving Stones, I title it that for two reasons. One is it's a double meaning. These are very loving forms of God. So they're loving stones, but it's also the worshipful act of loving stones. And this is a very intimate ritual that takes place in the homes where people care for one of these stones as an embodied form of divinity placed in their small temple or home shrine of some sort. So intimate interaction with these stones then becomes such a possibility for them.
That's really beautiful. I remember first seeing this title, Loving Stones, and hoping that you were intending that double meaning. I was like, oh, I think this could be read two ways. This us loving stones, but the stones are loving. And then you're in this kind of, intimate reciprocity of love with the more than human world. Geez,
Although
that's
I,
great.
I was going to say, although I don't take on, because I know a lot of listeners might be interested in the environmental issue in all
Mm.
this. I don't do that to the same degree I did in River of Love and An Age of
Right.
Pollution. But I do look at, and particularly in the last chapter, try to tease out the environmental implications, which I also did in the tree book. And that is that when one has that kind of relationship with some non-human entity, then you're going to treat that in a different way, right? Environmental psychologists say that we care about something to the degree that we're connected to it. And it's that loving connection. And once when you have that loving connection, whether it's with another human being or some non-human entity, that care leads to then protective measures. And so I play out some of those, not just possibilities, but I give examples of how that plays out on the ground in the protection of this particular mountain as well as other sacred mountains, and in some sense, by extension, the whole world itself. And so I do similar moves I did in the tree book with that.
Nice. I like that implication a lot, right? If you have one stone in your home, eventually that love starts to open up, love of the whole mountain, love of the whole earth. I know I've even felt this in like having a cat. And like once I fell in love with that cat, then any other animal I saw, I could kind of see the eyes of the cat. I'm like, oh no, I'm falling in love with it. See a cow on the side of the road. I'm like, that cow. And it's just, you just start to connect more and more. The more love you give, the more you receive. And I would imagine that that's, whatever tradition you're grounded in, that's going to be an insight that's, I think, relevant to all of us.
Yeah, that's a dynamic exactly that I say is operative here. I met a pujari. Pujari means a worship. He's the one who performs worship in one of the temples. And so in addition to home shrines, there are also large temples that have where worship of the stones is taking place in this region. And he told me that he's been worshiping these stones every day for 30 years. And that's just his position there. And he's really into it. So I had the privilege of just watching him perform and dress up. So this involves kind of anthropomorphic dressing up of stones and faces. And that's another issue I take on the book, of a positive way of looking at anthropomorphization rather than negative. But what he said to me is that on a couple occasions when he is, and this is hands-on worship, right, with his hands, and so it's embodied worship of embodied forms of divinity. And he said the stone just transformed, kind of a vision. The stone was transformed into the whole mountain. This is a mountain that's about 7 miles long. Transformed into the whole mountain. And they said, but it didn't stop there. Then it became the whole region of Brudge, this sacred area that I've been referring to here. And then he said the whole the whole country of India, the whole South Asian subcontinent. And then he said finally the whole world. And that was his way, is that this particular is not disconnected from the whole. It is a part of the whole. And by his worshipful interaction with and establishing a deep relationship with the particular, he is by extension having that relationship with the totality of all reality, which is what God is for him. So your cat, right? Someone who maybe doesn't like cats, but then has a cat, then all of a sudden they start liking cats, and from it grows, just in the way you described. And as I say, that is the dynamic I think is at play here.
Yeah, that's really that's beautiful. That's a beautiful insight to end on. I think once you've connected to the totality of reality, if you're gonna end on a high note, it's hard to beat that. So I'll have to say goodbye. But geez, like I've said to you before, I'm already planning on having you back sometimes. You just have too many interesting stories, and I really appreciate your perspective in general, connecting the local and the global, and respecting cultural difference. So it's just really a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for being on,
No, thank you, Sam. I've enjoyed talking with you also.
and thanks to everybody for tuning in. And we'll be back next week with some more conversations for you. In the meantime, take care and be well.